Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 2026 Nemo Talk series and our Sunshine Coast Ocean Festival. This is day two of the festival and day two of our Nemo Talk series. We're so glad you could join us. I'm Suzanne Sanger, the Executive Director of the Sunshine Coast Conservation Association, and I'm joining this Nemo Talk from Checkwelp Gibsons at Catsum Howe Sound on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Squamish people. The SCCA is a charitable nonprofit working to protect and restore biodiversity in the Sunshine Coast Natural Resource District, which is over 2 million hectares in the territories of the Squamish, Shishak, Tliamin, Klahoose, and Homolko First Nations. We are so grateful to the First Nations of these areas who have stewarded the lands and the waters, who have so many lessons to teach us and so much good work that we can help to support and engage in. We really root our work and our programming as much as possible in taking those lessons from the First Nations who are doing this work in our territory. And we really have a lot of respect for their leadership and their guidance. The SCCA, together with our program partner Rhizome Up Media, is just so excited for this year's Ocean Festival program and really grateful to our funders. This year we've got support from the District of Seashelt, the Sunshine Coast Credit Union, Ocean Week Canada, Sitka Foundation, BC government, and some Canada Summer Jobs funding. So that's all really helpful, and we really couldn't do it without the support of our funders. This year's program is full of amazing in-person and online film screenings, thought-provoking and inspiring films who are brought to us by our film programmer, Billy Carroll, alongside resources, interactive citizen science projects, educational activities, and of course, on June 14th, we're having our celebration day where we've got a ton of booths and different NGOs and groups coming together to share and celebrate our ocean. Our goal with this program is to inspire, engage, and connect people to encourage meaningful action to protect and restore the oceans we all depend on. That's why we're really excited for today's Nemo Talk and to host Dr. Chris Neufeld to share with us about kelp forests and restoration. Chris is a coastal biologist with LGL Limited. He's got over 20 years of experience in marine ecosystems in British Columbia and Washington, including 17 years leading research on coastal ecosystems. Dr. Neufeld has nearly a decade of experience designing, reviewing, and implementing coastal monitoring programs focused on aquatic biodiversity and the recovery of marine habitats and at-risk aquatic species. Over this time, Chris has developed a broad expertise in nearshore biodiversity conservation, kelp forest ecology, and ecological restoration. He also regularly contributes his expertise on several technical advisory committees related to fish and fish habitat for major projects in BC. Today, Chris will dive into the vibrant world of kelp to explore the ecology and conservation of these underwater forests. And Chris, we are just so thrilled to have you. Thank you for joining us. Go ahead.
Sure. So happy to be here. Thanks so much for that lovely intro. Yeah, welcome everyone. I currently live and reside in Kelowna on the traditional unceded territories of the Okanagan Silks peoples. But I've spent much of my life sort of tied to, and I still spend a lot of my working life on the coast or thinking about the coast or advising on issues related to marine species. And so my heart is very much still there, and or maybe divided, let's say, but currently raising my family here in Kelowna. And just really happy to be here to tell you a little bit today about kelp forests, about why they're so wonderful, about how they're doing, which is unfortunately not particularly well these days, and then sort of some of the approaches that researchers, including some work that I've led or participated in, to look at restoration opportunities and conservation opportunities for kelp forests. So with that, I will share my screen here and just jump right into it. All right, there we go. And just, of course, to check, can folks see that okay? Perfect, thumbs up. Love it. Actually, maybe just before I start onto the talk, I'll just say some briefly. Um, I currently work at LGL Limited, and we're a sort of medium-sized biological consulting company. Have only been there for 3 or 4 years, and as I kind of said in the intro, have been doing a lot of other work, but before that as well. But LGL's work is it is largely a continuation of the kind of work that I've been doing in the past. We largely on the BC coast support modern treaty nations and other First Nations in conservation and restoration and stewardship activities within their territories. And so it's work that I'm really grateful to participate in and in lots of ways sort of feels like a chance to work at a place that's like a giant Swiss Army knife now, where there's all these different people with all these different skills and knowledge and tools, and so when we're confronted with a problem, we can sort of pull all these people, pull all these tools and all these different layers of expertise to sort of solve that problem, whether it's tracking fish or restoring rivers or doing the kind of marine work that I do. Um, okay, so uh, a lot of the work that I'm going to be talking about today is work that I participated in a previous role with this big collaborative effort called the Kelp Rescue Initiative, founded at the Banff Marine Sciences Center and had some very generous support from many partners and funders, including a core funding for several years from the Gann Page Family Fund. And so this is just some of the folks that have contributed to this work, but I also just want to kind of give a shout out to a lot of collaborators that have led parts of this work and really helped shape some of the stuff I'll talk about today. And so that includes Dr. Julia Baum from UVic and several of her lab members, postdocs, and PhD students, Brian Timmer, Lauren Dykman, folks at the Kelp Rescue Initiative like Clay Steele and others that have really helped keep that program going. And then a colleague, Sam Starko, who really work that we started in Barkley Sound more than a decade ago now and have really kind of set the foundation for the stuff we'll talk about today. So just a huge thanks to those folks as well. Okay, so kelp forests. One of the ways that I like to think about kelp forests is to compare them to something that we hear a lot about in the global context, and that's coral reefs. And so on this map here, which is a graphic we developed at the Kelp Rescue Initiative quite a few years ago now, you can see coral reefs displayed here kind of in blue, these sort of light blue dots along the kind of tropical equator areas. And then this is where kelp forests sit on that same map. So they're these hugely important ecosystems. They cover an area 5 times as big as all coral reefs on the planet. And so they're this really critical foundational ecosystem that's of global importance, really. Um, and so what is kelp? We think about this and hear this a lot, including in the news these days. Well, um, so kelp are a group of large brown algae. Most of them in that we often lump together are in a particular group. And there's about 24 species in our waters in British Columbia and Washington. Um, Most of what I'll talk about today, and you can see some of these on the right hand side here, there's a whole bunch of different morphologies. Some of them are understory kelps, some of them have floats, some of them kind of lay down on the bottom. Some of them are quite small, like a meter or so long, and others are large, like the bull kelp and the giant kelp extending on the sides of that image. And what I'll be talking about today is bull kelp and giant kelp. And what we often lump those into what we call canopy forming species or surface canopy forming species. So they're the ones that you can see from above the water when you're boating around. And just because of their size, they have a really important ecological role. And so this is an image taken by Fernando Lessa in the Salish Sea, and it shows a school of herring swimming through a kelp forest. And I just want to kind of unpack this image a little bit and just use it to talk a bit about how important kelp forests are. And so in this image, we see a whole bunch of things. We see the understory, many understory species of kelp along the bottom. So these are the ones providing kind of lower habitat, providing food for invertebrates, hiding places for fish. And then you see these larger pole kelp individuals extending up into the water column. And within this ecosystem, there are, hundreds of species of invertebrates. There's, tens to, let's say 50 species of fish that might use these habitats at different times, including juvenile rockfish, commercially and culturally important species like juvenile and adult salmon, herring. So you really, we call them forests because they really act in the same way that forests do on land, providing all this habitat, all this space, all this food for different species and the species that they interact with. But because of their size, they also buffer coastal wave action, so they can really dampen the force of waves as they're coming onto coasts. I guess I alluded to this, but they harness this huge amount of solar energy and take carbon out of the water to turn that into this massive amount of biomass, this massive amount of food, and some of that floats off and it drifts off into other ecosystems, including some deep sea ones where it then contributes, that biomass contributes that sun energy to these other ecosystems as well. Um, and importantly, they also connect to other ecosystems. So that kelp detritus, the pieces of kelp that break off, might drift into a neighboring eelgrass bed. And there's been some recent, or sort of recent work in the last decade or so on the BC coast that actually shows that eelgrass beds and kelp forests that are living close to each other can actually benefit each other by sort of sharing species, providing and species that live in those habitats move quite readily between those two important parts of the ecosystem. And then I guess lastly, I alluded to this, but they're part of the salmon highway. These baby salmon that emerge from the gravels and the streams of headwaters, and they work their way down these rivers. And then once they make it to the estuaries, they spend a bit of time in the eelgrass, they spend a bit of time in the kelp, and then they move out into the open ocean. And then when they return, they also benefit from these habitats when they're heading back upstream as adults. And so, what does kelp? Um, how much kelp is there in BC? What does it look like? Well, one of the ways we can figure that out, certainly First Nations oral history is a hugely important piece of this, and there's many bits of oral history that speak to the value and the abundance and the widespread nature of kelp forests on our coasts. And then if you look a bit more recently to British Admiralty charts, kelp was actually noted on these charts because it was a hazard to shipping, right? It was a hazard that you get your rowboat snagged up or your large ship snagged up in these large kelp forests. And so they were marked on these maps. And so a project in 2019 by Mycera Costa at University of Victoria actually digitized those maps to use them to help map where kelp was observed on the coast and put on charts. And you can see here from this image on the right, anything red is where kelp forest was noted on a chart. And you can see that historically back in the sort of 1850s to 1950s, it was everywhere. It was in lots of places, including lots of places on the Sunshine Coast and in the Salish Sea. Um, and it was so abundant. This is just a clipping from the Comox Free Press from October 1968, saying pesky kelp turned into useful fertilizer and other products. It was so abundant that it was seen as sort of a nuisance, right? And that's certainly not the case anymore. And a recent IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change report, ranked kelp as the second most vulnerable ecosystem to climate change. So they really are quite vulnerable, only second to coral reefs, and really something that we need to pay attention to when we think about climate change and its potential impacts. And so with all that in mind, I was living on the BC coast. I was living in Barkly Sound, or at least working in Barkly Sound a lot on the west coast of Vancouver Island, when this huge marine heat wave that we've all heard about and I'm sure many people experienced firsthand, rolled through this coast. Um, this massive blob of warm water eventually moved inshore and caused some widespread, basically kept this warm water in places where it could potentially do harm to certain species. And I'll just point out a few things on this image on the right here. Um, One of them is it just, if you'll note, if you go down to kind of California here, where my cursor is down by the green, um, you'll see that there's actually quite a few places along the coast where it's quite cold because of this coastal upwelling. And even part way as you kind of work your way in towards the southern tip of Vancouver Island, the waters remain fairly cold. And then as you move up and towards the Sunshine Coast and then the kind of the core of the Salish or the northern Salish Sea, you'll see that's a place that was really affected by this heat wave, but in general, a place that has unusually warm waters relative to its geography. And we'll come back to that later on. And so that was kind of the backdrop in which I started thinking about kelp. Yeah, I guess about kelp forests specifically. So I've been doing a bunch of work on species that live in kelp forests and invertebrates that live near kelp forests, but I sort of just took the kelp forest for granted until my colleague Sam Starkman and I just started seeing places like this bay up here on the left of giant kelp, and this other place kind of behind Helby Island of bull kelp, where we saw them for many years, and then all of a sudden after the marine heat wave, they were gone. And so we started to wonder how widespread that was, and we embarked on a study to look at where on the coast had kelp before and where what parts of Barkley Sound it had been lost in, and found that after the heat wave, about 50% of the shoreline that used to have kelp, mostly the warmer inshore waters, had lost those canopy-forming kelp species over that same time period. So that was quite alarming, and it was something that at the time was just starting to be detected in a few other places in Washington, but hadn't been in Oregon and California, but hadn't really been detected in BC. And then the other thing, as we started to kind of wonder more about what some of the causes of those declines were, one of them was likely, and we had evidence that there was a direct effect of the warm water on the kelp. But we wondered if there were some indirect effects of that marine heat wave as well. And so the other thing that happened during that 2014 to 2016 marine heat wave um, was this endemic of this disease that affected sea stars called sea star wasting disease. Um, and it was incredibly devastating to these populations of sea stars, which used to just be everywhere. And I'm sure anyone that's old enough to remember those before times, they used to just be incredibly common all up and down the coast. You could see them off any dock. And they were these voracious predators of kind of anything they could get their hands on, or their arms on, I suppose. But in particular, they really like to eat sea urchins. And by after the heat wave, their populations had declined by 94%. And so they were functionally lost from this ecosystem, which we'll see in a bit had a really important impact on kelp forests in certain places, depending on what was happening in the food web in those kelp forests. So um, this is what in ecology is often called a trophic cascade, but it's just this idea that you can have something happen to one part of a food web or an ecosystem, and it can cascade its way through to other components. The image on the left is an image taken by Lynn Lee up in Haida Gwaii, but it's an amazing illustration of just how a single sunflower sea star can strike fear into the hearts of hundreds of sea urchins. And so these sea stars, when they're present, can be a really effective control of sea urchins, pushing them into all the crevices, making them the sea urchins much more passive feeders of kelp, because the sea urchin's favorite food is kelp. And so once those sunflower sea stars were lost, you'll see on the right here, both in Barkley Sound, where there's some data from Parks Canada that we analyzed, and some work out of Howe Sound as well, out of Isabel Cote's lab at Simon Fraser University, showed that just as over time, as the sea stars disappeared, the sea urchin populations really took off. They really got out of balance, and those sea urchins then went and mowed down all of or a lot of the kelp in these places. So we were starting to see in our work in Barkley Sound and elsewhere that it was this combination of threats. It was the direct effects of marine heat waves in places where the water was just getting too warm for the kelp's ecology, but also this indirect effect of loss of these predators in some places. So what we did then was we turned more broadly and kind of thought about, well, this coast is really a patchwork of challenges for kelp, and it really depends on where you are. So this is just an image taken from it's a model out of University of Washington, but it accurately or closely reflects the actual conditions of sea surface temperature. This was just a snapshot from summer 2018, just as an example. But again, you'll see that there's anything red is really warm, anything blue and green is quite cool. Um, and purple. And so what you'll see is this real patchwork of temperatures. So summer temperatures are quite variable across BC, and in particular the Salish Sea and some of these fjords along the west coast of Vancouver Island and other places in the North Salish Sea and South Salish Sea get quite warm. And some of these areas exceed the thermal tolerance of kelp. But other areas, like this area sort of south of Victoria, actually might offer, and some areas up in the Broughton region as well, might offer some really important thermal refugia during heat waves. So those are places that actually do just fine for kelp in those conditions. And then I don't have a graphic for it, but just important to note that sea stars aren't the only predators of urchins on this coast. Right, the other major predator of urchins are sea otters. Sea otters were wiped out from this coast, as many of you likely know, due to the fur trade. And then they were reintroduced on the west coast of Vancouver Island, just south of the Brooks Peninsula in the late 1960s, and have been spreading and expanding ever since, both north up the coast and now as also further south, just starting to poke into Barkley Sound. And so there's some places that we hypothesize might be protected either because of the cold water that's there, like the places south of Victoria, but also places that might be more or less susceptible to kelp losses because there were sea otters there. All right, so we wanted to try to get at this somehow, and so what we did was we looked at as many places where we knew there was a historical set of imagery from either a plane or a helicopter that had flown through. So either through the BC Shore Zone program or Environment Climate Change Canada had some imagery from helicopters as well, where we could compare sort of a before heat wave to an after heat wave snapshot of that part of the coast and look on 20, let's say 20 or 40-meter segments of each of these parts of coastline and just see whether there was kelp before in the previous image and then in the after heat wave image as well. And so we did this in however many regions. There are 11 regions up and down the coast where we had imagery. And anything you see here in red means that those are sections of shoreline where kelp was lost from that between the kind of before and after snapshot. Anything light blue is where those sections of shoreline were stable, and anything in dark blue actually shows an increase in shoreline segments that had kelp. And so what you can see here is that there is really this patchwork where there's some places in the north where a lot of kelp has been lost from the shoreline. Certain places kind of central where sea otters still exist, where there's actually been some increases, places like Nuka Sound um, and further north up in Quatsino. And then in the southern area, there's sort of a mix as well. Some places along the southern edge of Vancouver Island where the water is quite cool, kelp seem to be quite stable. But other places, certainly as you wrap around and move into the Salish Sea, we've seen quite large declines in kelp forest there as well. So that's sort of the state of affairs. And so, you know, that these were findings that were front of mind when we started to ask the question of what can we do about this? Actually, I'll go back here. And with a really generous donation from the Gann Page Family Fund and support from the Banfield Marine Sciences Center, we worked to initiate this project to really try to answer that question. What can we do to help kelp? Called the Kelp Rescue Initiative, something that I led for quite a while before moving to LGL, and work that's been carried on since by lots of wonderful people, including the ones I mentioned at the beginning. So that's kind of going to be part two of this talk. And before we get there, though, we just need to learn a little bit about kelp, a little bit about its life cycle, because it's really kind of critical to understanding sort of what the tools are for restoration. And so here's the deal with kelp. Unlike something like, I don't know, a carrot or something that you might plant in your garden, there's no such thing as kelp seed exactly. but instead it has this complex life cycle that I'll just walk you through here. So what you think about when you think about kelp is likely this large adult, what we call a sporophyte. Um, and that adult sporophyte creates these, kind of grows these little patches on its tissues called sporangia. Those produce little spores, but those spores, rather than like a carrot seed or something just settling and growing back into a new carrot, they actually settle and they have this alternate life cycle that's microscopic. Happens at the bottom of the ocean, usually in the winter, in the pitch dark, where those spores grow into these little kind of filamentous structures called gametophytes. There's males and females. Males release sperm. Those sperm actually swim over to the eggs of the females. They fertilize those eggs, and then that fertilized egg then grows up back into this adult sporophyte that we see at the surface of the ocean in early spring in the next year. And so that's really important when we think about restoration, because we need to kind of understand and harness that life cycle to be able to effectively work with these species. And so this is what those things look like now in real life. So in the center here is just a image of a bull kelp spore patch that I took up in the Broughton region one year. So all that brown in the middle is the spore patch full of little spores. We can release those spores in the lab into a little test tube, or we can collect the kelp from the field, release it into the lab, and then grow those spores into these little baby gametophytes on the plate you see here down here on the right. And then just the image on the left is just a zoomed in image with a microscope that just shows you what one of those gametophytes look like. And so when we think about restoring or planting kelp, there's this extra step where you have to bring these spores into the lab, you have to grow them in the lab, you have to then release these gametophytes or these ideally fertilized eggs back out into the wild. So it's kind of a complex process. And so this is the challenge. How do we go when we think about restoration of kelp with that newfound knowledge of kelp biology? How do we go from this kind of warm urchin barren to this thriving kelp forest? I won't talk too much about this today, but I'll just give you a few big picture thoughts or big picture ideas on what people are trying, what's worked, what's not, and sort of just the nature of the challenge that we're facing when we think about kelp forest restoration. And can kind of be broken down into a few categories. So what are the tools we can use? Well, one is we can just, if there's a place that used to have kelp and it doesn't anymore, we can just try to plant some kelp using these laboratory tools available to us. The second one is we can physically go in and remove those grazers or exclude them. So either remove urchins or exclude urchins from certain places so the kelp can grow back. And we can also spend a bit of time trying to find populations of kelp that can handle the heat better than others. And so those are kind of the three approaches that I'll talk briefly about today in the last part of my talk. So how do you seed kelp? Well, as I said, you bring it back into the lab. You grow these little gametophytes, and then you can either seed those gametophytes directly onto string, and you can then spread that string out right on the rocks if you want to bolt it down, or you can suspend it on a line somewhere. But you can also kind of seed those gametophytes and small sporophytes, small adult kelps onto little pieces of gravel or rocks and try that, just throwing those from a boat or placing them with divers. You can even just take those spore patches from the adult kelp, put them in a bag, tether that bag to the bottom of the ocean, and hope that those spores naturally settle, do their thing in the winter, and then produce adult kelp in the spring. So those are kind of the options. Um, and I'll just touch on a couple sort of adaptations of those, I suppose. There's something called RCEVS that the Nature Conservancy has been spearheading the last several years. And this is the idea of you're kind of both excluding grazers and growing kelp at the same time. So you make this sort of array made out of metal and PVC. You anchor it to the bottom temporarily for a season, and you seed the kelp right onto that so that it's harder for urchins to come up and get the kelp, but you're also providing more habitat for those species that depend on it within that season. And then they would go back in with divers, remove those at the end of the year, and then do it again the next year. And similar work has been happening out of Hornby Island diving on Hornby Island for the last on and off for more than a decade. where they have an array of lines that they seed every year with kelp, with the effort of just, or with the intent of just providing some habitat temporarily for species that depend on it. Um, the other option is you can just control grazers directly. One way is to build fences. So again, Hornby Island Diving and other folks have done various approaches to try to exclude grazers, exclude urchins from certain patches. So you can at least have, just like you keep deer out of your garden, you might keep urchins out of your one spot where you want the kelp to naturally grow back, or where you want to be seeding kelp with one of these other tools. Um, in the middle is just an approach that's been developed the last couple of years to actually sort of do both those things. So these are little sort of sea urchin lassos that are embedded into this, so that as the urchins try to climb up, they get stuck by these little lassos. They can't make it to the kelp, which has been outplanted in the middle. Um, and then there have been some really widespread efforts in California to actually just remove the urchins. There's so many urchins that they work with recreational divers, and they go down and they just smash them to just there's so many, they smash them. Those urchins get eaten by other species or decompose, and then that creates these urchin-free areas that have actually been quite successful in kelp naturally recruiting to, now that the grazers are gone, and regrowing back into a kelp forest. So those are kind of the tools available for grazers. And then lastly, I don't want to spend too much more time, but just some work that we initiated several years ago now in collaboration with Hornby Island Diving, um, work led by Lauren Dykeman at Kelp Rescue Initiative, to look for populations that can handle the heat. So we went out to, I guess, 5 different places. We collected kelp spores, or yeah, I guess kelp spores, brought those back to the lab, grew those up into strings, and then we took those baby kelp out, and we planted them kind of in this array at Hornby Island to see how kelp from different places did in that really warm Salish Sea environment in the summer. Um, I'll kind of skip through this, but those were just our sites. Our outplanting site was Hornby Island, right in front of kind of Maud Reef, in front of Hornby Island diving there. Just what this looks like here, once the kelp was outplanted, and then we just measured it to see how the kelp from these different places did in this really warm water environment. Um, this is just a video just showing sort of what that outplanted kelp looks like when it's on some of these lines. So you can see it's suspended from the bottom, so that urchins can't get to it. So it's kind of a good natural laboratory to grow these things in the absence of urchins. Um, and this is sort of midsummer, just before it got up to the warm water. Let's go through. Okay. And this is just I won't show you too many graphs on this presentation, but just one graph just showing one of the main findings from that work is that we measured how fast the blades, the kind of leaves of the kelp, grew over that summer season, and found that the ones from warmer water areas actually grew faster. So Oyster River and Gabriela Island, which at least on the Vancouver Island side of the North Salish Sea are the two kind of furthest warm water populations of kelp that exist there. And those grew the fastest. So that was quite an interesting finding. Whereas the ones from either further away or the ones from cooler waters like Victoria actually grew the slowest. So they did not grow nearly as well in those warm water environments. So just showing that both distance to transplant site, but also warm water, or the water temperature of the of the origin site actually affected how quickly those grew. Okay, I do want to leave lots of time for discussion and questions, but I'll just kind of end with, yeah, I guess what I hope are some of the takeaways, and maybe some things to sort of seed the conversation here. One is just that, kelp forests and kelps are these complex ecosystems that really are threatened by climate change, and I've shown you some examples of that from BC waters. In BC, it's really in the Northeast Pacific, it's really not a one size fits all explanation of the problem. It's a patchwork of declines, of places that are stable or increasing, and as a result, the kind of restoration tools need to be matched to what's happening in each local area. I think it's important to note that the main impacts I've been describing here are either direct or indirect effects of climate change. And so the best solution is to remove the stressor. And so to really think about the root cause of these issues has to do with these much broader global scale patterns. And individually, we have a small part to play, but nonetheless, it's a really important thing to remember that if these are ecosystems that we really care about, that things we do more broadly to think about and address um, patterns of changing climate and causes of those changes that can really help these ecosystems as well. And just that restoration can provide some help, but it's definitely not a silver bullet. It's certainly not as easy to restore these forests in places where they've been lost because the reasons they've been lost are some of them are global and other ones are just hard to scale. But there's certainly some work happening that's really promising, but in terms of scaling these to larger places or larger areas, there's certainly still some work to do. And I guess finally, just to conclude that, yeah, there's really strong partnerships like the ones I've talked about today, a whole bunch of different tools and approaches that are tailored to these local conditions, both a really a good understanding of those local conditions, and then the tools that can really address each challenge where it's seen is really the way to do something here. Yeah, and I guess just the last thing I'll say is, well, actually, I'll end there and turn it over to questions because I think we'll get to some of these other bigger questions there as well.
Chris, that's a lot of really amazing work you're doing and such a good presentation. I mean, so much food for thought. I usually take this moment to just kind of point out a couple of, the key things that really stuck in my brain as you were talking. And one of them is, that kelp was so abundant in the past that it was considered a weed. And now it is, the second most vulnerable um, marine species to climate change, and how that's the big issue that we're facing, and it affects everything. And then also just the job that kelp does, absorbing so much carbon, and then feeding all the other ecosystems and maintaining this habitat for all the other creatures that are inextricably linked. And also, when I was looking at your maps as you were going along, I was kind of shocked. Before heat wave, after heat wave, red sections in Howe Sound and Jervis Inlet was like, wow, that felt like the loss of the kelp in those spaces really it hits close to home for the Sunshine Coast. So yeah, so many good things to talk about. I'm just gonna, for the folks who weren't here at the beginning, we're gonna have a Q&A now. So if you've got questions for Chris, please, put up your hand if you'd like to ask the question, and we'll call on you in the order that you put your hands up. And if you're shy and don't want to do that, please go ahead and pop a question in the chat and I will read them out loud and Chris will answer them. And if possible, we would love to see your faces, folks. We're all so Zoomified that we sometimes just keep our videos off, but we'd love to see you if you're open to that. No pressure, but feel free. And of course, we've got Sarama in here, and he's asked the first question. And it is, are there any plans to reintroduce sea otters into the Salish Sea anytime soon?
Yeah. So I mean, it's interesting, and I suppose I mentioned this briefly, but you know, when we think about these ecosystems, they're inextricably linked with the people that have depended on them and stewarded them since time immemorial, and the complex, just the social conditions around all these things. And so certainly from, as when I put on my ecologist hat, it's certainly something, that's something that has been discussed amongst ecologists as a theoretical thing, as like, oh, yeah, sure, in places where, I showed some of this data, but in places where sea otters were reintroduced and in places where their populations are spreading, it is having a positive effect on kelp forests, and that's what we predict as an ecologist. but it's not nearly as simple as that because it's not this isn't an ecosystem without people, and it's really up to the nations whose territories these things are happening in to steward those in the ways that make sense to them and for them.
Yeah, and we heard a presentation yesterday from Shelley Kemp, and she's with the Wasanich Marine Guardians program, and they had spotted a sea otter. And so that was kind of a really exciting moment to go, they're going to move. As they come back, they're going to find their places. Um, yeah, Hannah.
I actually was about to ask a similar question to the question that Dirk just posted in the chat. So Suzanne, maybe you want to read Dirk's question. And basically, I would love to hear more about your research into how kelp adapt or tolerate warming waters based on the research that you did. And then, yeah, we can read Dirk's question. It's similar.
So,
Sure.
oh, yeah, maybe you want to answer that first, and then we'll get to the question, or do you want to, what do you,
Well, why don't you read it and then I'll
yeah.
answer them both at the same time.
Okay, sounds good. So, Chris, you did not mention the notion of moving kelp varieties more adapted to warming. Is that because the main heat stressor is primarily the loss of urchin predators and all varieties thrive in the warmer Georgia Strait? I'm writing from Lasqueti, a midpoint of the warming.
Yeah, I mean it's so that initial the experiment I just kind of ended on where we took kelp from a bunch of different places, from cold places and warm places, and we moved them to a warm place. We kind of had mixed results. So the ones that came from the warmest waters typically did a little bit better there, or at least were different than the ones from cooler waters. Um, but if you look at the current distribution of where kelp is, where canopy forming kelp forests exist within the North Salish Sea, there's huge areas that used to have kelp that no longer do, and that's just because it's almost always too warm for kelp there. And so, the options then are to either seed kelp every year in certain places where it's important in the spring, and then just not have it reproduce naturally. Certainly moving kelp from warmer waters potentially might help in certain places, but then there's a lot of complex challenges around the genetics of and risks around the genetics of moving kelp from really far away, into our waters. So there's certainly lots more work that would have to be done before that was ever tried. But it's certainly something that's happening more so in Australia, and it's certainly being talked about globally. And there's some work in California to really look in very great detail at the genetics of thermal tolerance how that can be improved. But it's just not it's not like it's not the be all end all solution for sure because I think largely because of the other risks associated with it.
Yeah, innovating solutions, and then sometimes we get ahead of ourselves as humans, and yeah, invasive species is kind of one of those things that comes to mind for me, right? When you're, yeah. So we had a couple of questions too that we were, Hornby Island is well known for its prolific herring spawn. Is the kelp, like the kelp work, somehow related to the success of the herring spawn? Are these two things, is anybody sort of watching that or tracking that? Are they connected?
So yeah, it's super interesting. So kelp, as you say, right? Kelp forests and herring, certainly in certain parts of the coast at certain times of year, you know, kelp are a really important substrate for herring spawn. Culturally, that's a really important piece to many First Nations. Um, and so in on Hornby, the herring spawn happens pretty early, and that it is a huge hotspot, right? But it happens when the kelp are very small.
Mm.
So the bull kelp typically are they're not at a size where they'd be used very much, and they're like this big when the herring come through for the most part. And that's partly, yeah, anyway, so there's not a direct connection. Certainly some of the understory kelps are used more. Um, as anyone who's been to the herring spawn or seen herring spawn anywhere, they'll spawn all over the place on all kinds of things, and certainly including kelp. But yeah, there's no direct connection between that work and the herring spawn that happens on Hornby.
That's fascinating. Yeah, it's easy to assume one thing would be connected with the other, but not necessarily the case. Dirk had a follow-up. He said his question was from a concern of doing all the work to restore healthy conditions, but having seeded with local kelp, still not having a successful restoration. Oh, so Dirk, do you want to pop in? Not to put the pressure on you, but if you're doing this work, it'd be really interesting to see you.
Uh,
Hi.
Here I am. I don't know that that makes changes anything. And no, I've been most of my work's been terrestrial, planting trees, but we have done a fair bit of intertidal littoral restoration work. A lot of eelgrass, other work like that. I'd love to go into. We come for the last 45 years to Boat Cove on Lasqueti Island, which had huge kelp beds all on the eastern shore and of the cove, and in all of the proper depths, it was all kelp beds, and they're all gone. So yes, it'd be great to restore this area, and we've been looking at a little bit of the massive population of urchins and gaining an umi appetite, but that's not going to change much. And what do we bring in? And if we begin a few patches of do some work to open a few restoration possibilities, that thermal California thermal research is going to be very important. So I'll do my best to try and find it. And hi again, Chris. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. No. No. Glad to see your face, and um, I think we actually may have some kind of a connection through the Betts family in Nelson, where I grew up. But anyway, that's a just based on what you just said there, we may have some connection. Um,
We've actually met briefly once, but yes. All right.
so that this is one of the challenges when we embarked on this work was to really think about, are there some, or you know as we really got a handle on at least I mean lots of people had a handle on this before I did, but just more like as we started to become aware of these losses in one place on the coast and then started to really scale up and think about what's happening in other places, there's certain places like the North Salus Sea that the conditions may just be too warm for kelp for the foreseeable future. And so one option for sure is it's possible that there's some thermally tolerant populations that could do better there. Um, Something else to note is that often in that place, and certainly around Hornby and Denman, and I'd imagine where you are as well, um, the kelp that has been lost often has been replaced by an introduced species, which is Sargassum muticum, this Japanese wireweed, and it doesn't, it was concerning as it was moving in. It's been around for quite a while, but it sort of forms this narrow band close to where you used to see kelp along the shores. And I've done a little bit of work over the years with students, the Marine Sciences Center in Banfield and elsewhere, to just look at how, you know, is that providing good habitat and for which species, and sort of is it good to see it there or not? And one of the questions was, is it displacing kelp? And the answer was no, but it's sort of opportunistically moving in after kelp has been lost. But it's actually doing an okay job of not fulfilling
Okay.
all of those sort of ecosystem functions of kelp, but at least some of them. So that's at least a hopeful part of that whole question. But yeah, it's certainly that's a big one, and there may just be some places where it makes more sense to do other things. Think about restoring, other ecosystems that also benefit salmon and herring, rather than thinking specifically about bringing kelp back in these places.
Um, Fascinating. Yeah, see, I get that like little bit of fear of the other species that we don't know well enough, and what if they do really well and they do the displacing. So I mean, I want to follow in and get into the details of like, how do you know they're not displacing the kelp? I mean, have you had long enough to study them? These are questions that come up. Yeah. But I guess,
Yeah, and I mean, and those ones were, I mean, Japanese wireweed wasn't brought in as a solution at all. It was brought in as packing material for Japanese oysters back in the day, right? And then from there just spread. But just more that it's yeah, that as these ecosystems change, there are some of the changes are might actually be okay for certain species at least.
yeah. Yeah, I think of like Japanese knotweed as the first thing that popped into my head. The battle of, and we do like most of the work that we do is terrestrial.
Right.
And so that's where the parallels, there's so many parallels on the land side. So here was a question of why aren't we harvesting and eating urchins as they do in other areas? Is it what's our issue? What's holding us back?
Yeah. Yeah, and I didn't it's so hard when you're trying to decide what to talk about in only 20 minutes or so, but there certainly is some work happening there as well. There's been quite a few recent cultural harvests of sea urchins in various communities that we've worked with or that I'm aware of. Um, One of the issues is that if you end up with these urchin barrens, these places that are devoid of kelp, the urchins don't have any roe in them. They're not basically not edible. There's nothing in them. They're just kind of empty. Um, there's a company in California that's actually harvested urchins from these urchin barrens where they're in poor condition, fed them for 2 weeks to a month or 2 months in a tank somewhere, and then basically fattened them up so that they then developed the roe and then sold them to restaurants and things. So that's one approach. Um, there's also, and anyone who's ever talked to an urchin harvester might have heard this, but that sea urchin, there's kind of a band of urchins right along the edge of the kelp forest that's in really good condition, and as you work your way down, they're in kind of poor condition. But so there's sort of a bit of a potential for selective harvest, where if there's places where you can kind of harvest these good ones and then let the other ones kind of move up and then harvest those ones later. But that's certainly part of the solution. Um, it's the trick is just thinking about the scale, right? It's just sort of, and one of the ways that we've tried to approach that, or I've tried to think about it, is just, you know, yeah, maybe you can't deal with all the 10,000 linear kilometers of shoreline on the BC coast, but if there's one place that you care about and that you know about and that would, benefit by having more kelp there, for instance, you can sort of start small and start local and still have a benefit to the salmon that swim by that particular kelp forest. And that's kind of one way to, make a difference in a way that's meaningful to your local area.
Yeah, start small and start local.
Hmm.
That's bite-sized chunks that people can actually do. Because the ocean is vast and the issues are vast and it's hard to see when you're not a diver. And so I think that's a really important message, actually, Chris, for this conversation is like the little places where people can actually do something that can make a difference. And I feel like, yeah, what you just said, I mean, it's fascinating to hear from Dirk, who's going like, we want to plant, we just want the right species. So like knowing your name, Dirk Brinkman, and realizing that, in the tree planting world, you like you, what I want to say is that like we've got different um, levels of engagement and awareness and capacity to help and support this work, right? So some folks who are going to be like, yep, this is a project, we can grab it and do some restoration. And other people are going to need like those really simple ways to take action and to help. And that's one of the main goals of our Ocean Festival and bringing people like you here, Chris, is to like remind us and help us and guide us. Like, how can we help your work?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, this is something that, on and off I've devoted a lot of my kind of professional life and my chats with my friends over beers on a Friday night or whatever to really, devote a lot of my time and effort to it, but it's certainly not needed to make a difference, I think. And I think it's it's a challenge. All these things are challenging problems. And so the first piece is to, yeah, as you say, give yourself permission to start small. And for some people that might be just having just contributing either financially or through volunteer time to some of these organizations that are doing this work. And there's a whole bunch of them up and down the coast that do a lot of important work in this space. And so it's just supporting that work that way. It could be phoning folks at local organizations that are doing projects that you are already aware of and seeing if you can volunteer. Either there's projects where citizens go out and help just map kelp in their kayaks, right? And just keep track of what's happening. So that's kind of just helping, be the eyes and the ears on the water and provide that knowledge and that information, to just pay attention to what's happening so that you can spot new changes. You can spot the return of kelp in places where it hasn't been. You can spot this new patch of sea urchins that you hadn't seen before. All those things really do make a big difference. And even as a sort of desktop scientist for a lot of my work these days, every time I'm out in the ocean, I see something that's relevant to my work and that's really, really valuable, or experience something. And then, yeah, I guess the other piece is that as I said earlier, like the kelp, one of the main threats to kelp forests is climate change, and that's a huge, big, wicked problem. But one of the things that we can do as well is if we think about things like salmon, or let's take salmon as a great example, right? That there's lots of threats and stressors facing salmon, and so there's lots of other things we can do to support salmon. That's let's say we can't, there's less we can do in one area. Maybe we can support a project that's more of a riparian restoration effort, or those kinds of pieces, right? So it's sort of thinking more broadly across the ecosystem, and thinking about eelgrass work that's happening, and thinking about river work that's happening, and maybe those are places you can support as well.
Yeah. No, it's so true. Everything is so connected. And then Dirk was making another comment about like the idea of invasives is complex. Just, yeah, from like he's reminded of the Pacific Gyre and the many kinds of flotsam, including a completely intact Japanese fishing boat that washed up. Yeah. And so, yeah, and you can't stop. We just last night we watched this film called Turtle Walker, and it's this beautiful story of a man who spends his life walking the beaches to identify uh, turtle nesting spots. And then a tsunami comes and wipes out these places. And I mean, it's a beautiful story. And in the end, there's hope. But there are just these things that we can't control. So finding those places where we can, do everything you can in your power to fight the climate change and, pull the styrofoam out of the sea and riparian work and support. I loved what you said about anytime you're in your kayak, looking down and maybe finding a way to support mapping, monitoring, that kind of thing. If you're already playing in the water in some way or another, you may have right in front of you an opportunity to help support that. We do eelgrass mapping, we do forage fish sampling. These are same, but very, different, but same. So yeah, one of the things again with this festival and with our amazing website is that with this talk, we've got, we'll record it, we'll post it back on our website. We'll have a whole bunch of resources about Chris's work, about the science. And then if you can, think of other ways or groups. I saw Project Watershed was in there, some of the other ones in the First Nations. We can put links to their websites and ways for people to really connect. Because that's what the hope is with all of this is, we connect, we learn, and then we contribute where we can. And so, yeah, I just want to say again, thank you. Thank you for all your amazing work and your passion and for taking care of the kelp and acknowledge how that will affect in a good way everything across biodiversity and the ecosystems. Kelp's really important. It's a forest too. And so yeah. And then I just want to promote Sunshine Coast Ocean Festival, folks. We have some upcoming tomorrow. We've got a talk by Greg Oldford, who's section head for Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and Greg will introduce how ocean computer models, including The Nemo Host Sea model can help reconstruct past ocean conditions such as temperatures, currents, and mixing. So there's this really neat modeling project going on that we can look at, see the past, project into the future, and see how climate change is affecting things. And then tomorrow night we've got a film, short film, Salmon Secrets, that's done by Clackwood Action. It's about fish farming. And Alexandra Morton's gonna be zooming in to chat with us after the film. And then, yeah, so tomorrow's a busy day as well. And then we've got more events all throughout the week. And we just really hope folks will dive in, explore, and connect, like we say. So thanks again, Chris. Really appreciate you being here and sharing with us. And yeah, happy Ocean Festival.
Thanks for having me.
Take care.